All right. Well, good afternoon. Well, good morning, everybody. We'll get started just because we only have 30 minutes. I really want to maximize the time. I don't have a presentation, so what I wanted to do is just quickly highlight some of the progress that we've made in the district, but focus on some of the things that we believe have led us to that progress, focusing, as I did in my presentation and maybe in the discussion downstairs around principal quality, but really here to answer any questions that you may have about Chicago, things that you've read, things that you've heard, or just things that you have wondered about. So as it was stated in the introduction, Chicago really is a district on the rise. As it was also noted, I've been in the district my entire life, so I've had the opportunity to see CPS from so many different vantage points. And you know, one thing we often talk about in CPS is the kind of the demarcation for large-scale reform in our district happened in 1987 when then Secretary of Education Bill Bennett famously said that Chicago Public Schools was one of the worst school systems in the country. And hopefully you've never heard that before, but in Chicago we heard it loud and clear and didn't forget it. And at the time I was probably about in 5th grade, but even just remember some of the changes that happened as a result of that, and I won't go through the history of reform in Chicago because it's a long history and a lot of ups and downs, but it centered on a few things. Leadership was extremely important, and leadership in so many different domains. From one standpoint, parent leadership became extremely important. In Chicago, we are the only school system in Illinois that has a system called local school councils, where every single school pretty much has its own mini board. That was born out of that reform. In 1995, we shifted from district and board control to mayoral control. So the mayor actually appoints the district's superintendent, which was then at the time changed to CEO. And for a long time, the CEO of Chicago Public Schools was a person that had a strong business background, because people felt like that's what the district needed at that time in order to kind of make the turn that needed to occur. But leadership around principals became extremely important, and although the first 10 years in that change, 10 or 12 years, there was stability at the top, at the CEO level. We had 2 superintendents, Paul Vallis and Arnie Duncan, both served for a considerable amount of time. But after that, we saw a lot of transition and change. I think there have been 7 or 8 CEOs since Arnie left, which is crazy. And of course, I want to stop that trend, but I plan to. So being a person that has served in every single role possible in the district and also has a stake in the district, I think the most important stake, having a child or children in the district, I think that's extremely important. And so I'm honored to be serving in this role, and I'm honored to be coming in at a time where a lot of the initiatives that we are implementing are things that are philosophically aligned with my leadership style and how I think we get from where we are to where we need to be. And so principal leadership is an important lever, as I stated earlier. Just so you understand the context around it, and then I'll talk a little bit about the framework. There are 2 areas in Chicago where I feel like the infrastructure is there to support that work from beginning to end, and that's around post-secondary support and principal leadership. And when I talk about that ecosystem, I'm referring to the fact that the pre-K through 12 system is aligned to the secondary or the higher ed school systems. It is aligned to the philanthropic community, the business community. Everybody supports those 2 efforts. And so I recall a time in CPS where we did not have a strong college-going culture. That has since changed. If you walk into any one of our schools, I don't care what part of town you're in, people know what the program is, they know what the strategy is around college success for students, and we're actually in a place now where we're taking that to the next level with some policy changes that you may have heard of, called Learn, Plan, Succeed, where every student will graduate with a concrete post-secondary plan. It got a lot of attention because people thought we were saying every kid has to go to college. That isn't what we were saying. We were actually saying every child has to walk away with a plan. And the reason we're able to put out ambitious goals like that is because every single time we set a goal, our students meet that goal and we continue to move that goalpost, which I think is extremely important. So Learn, Plan, Succeed. College persistence has been something that we've done well. We've seen more and more graduates, thousands of graduates, I'm not even talking about percentages, more and more kids leaving our schools, going off to college. Now we're focused on persistence, making sure they end up in the right schools. And so there's a lot of work organized around that. The second piece is around principals. And the framework, the same ecosystem is in place. If you talk to folks, they know that our level for change is working with, and empowering school leaders and ensuring that they select talented teachers to lead our district. And again, the philanthropic community, higher ed, people are in line. We have partnerships, not just partnerships, vendor relationships, et cetera, with a lot of our universities to ensure that everybody's being held accountable for that. So we can't have 600 great principals, which is our goal, and we actually track that through a sophisticated matrix. The goal is to make sure every school has a high quality principal, and we won't stop until we get there. And the framework works like this. We place a big premium on identifying leaders and placement first. And I would say the lion's share of the work was focused around that. So every university that has a principal preparation program in Chicago knows what the expectations are. We actually have, in addition to the state requirement to be a principal in Chicago, we have our own set of requirements. It's called principal eligibility, and principals must demonstrate a level of competency beyond the state certification in order to lead one of our schools. And so for the first 10 years, I think we focused primarily on those two domains, identifying talent and placement of talent. More recently, we focused on the other two components in the continuum, in the talent continuum, which is enroll, professional development and training, because it's not enough just to find talented people and put them in a situation if you're not going to support them to be successful. And then retention. So retention looks like, first of all, making sure we put people at the right schools in the first place, because you want to make sure it's the right fit for the community and for the individual leading, because even if you end up where you want to be, being a principal is a very difficult job. I often say it's the best job I ever had. That's still true. No offense to this one, but it's still the best job. But it's also probably one of the most demanding jobs one could have. So principal retention has been a big area of focus for us. And just to give you a couple of quick stats around that, Chicago Public Schools right now has an annual departure rate of around 17% for principals. So any of you who have read Churn and some of the other literature about principal transition, while 17% is not anything we want to brag about, it is much lower than the national average, period. And it's much lower than the national average for urban schools, which is somewhere almost close to 30%. And what the Churn article also, research also noted is that the role of principal was the second most challenging job after what? No. I know the person from New York Leadership Academy should probably know this. Coal miner. The only other field that had a higher turnover rate was coal mining. So that tells you how, how hard it is. And so as a district, we take that seriously, and we've organized a lot of our work. We have 3 big programs that I'm just going to talk about quickly and then take your questions that we use to retain high quality principals. First, we have an independent school principals program, which is a program that principals apply to annually. And principals that have demonstrated that they, deserve complete autonomy for lack of, except for state and other things that are mandatory. These principals do not have a direct supervisor that is like a network chief or a principal supervisor. As long as they maintain the academic performance that the school has maintained, as long as they maintain the compliance requirements and turn in everything that they're supposed to turn in. And then the third piece is kind of more of a social thing, like can they manage the parent component, because as many of you know, a lot of our high performing schools tend to have the most involved and engaged parents, and in some of those schools, not having a direct supervisor can be problematic because problems tend to become out of control. So those are like the pretty much the 3 components. And right now, out of our 650 schools in our portfolio, we have that includes district and charter schools, so about 530 are district schools. About 70 of them are independent schools, with the goal of us getting to at least a third of those schools eventually being able to operate independently. And we believe that that allows us to do a few things. First of all, it gives those principals the ability to be autonomous and to innovate. We know that innovation happens much quickly at the local level than it does at the district level. We actually learn a lot from our independent school principals, and we're able to try to bring some of that stuff to scale. The other thing that it does is it allows our networks, the principal supervisor structures, to focus on the schools that really need it. Any of you that have served as either superintendent or network or principal supervisor, you know that not every school needs the same amount of intervention, support, supervision, etc. And so really minimizing the number of schools in each network chief's portfolio is extremely important to us. The second thing we do is we have a principal fellows program, which I talked a little bit about downstairs. And what we did here, and I know a lot of these programs exist across the country, like the Khan Fellowship, I know there's another one that's escaping me. There are plenty of these where we basically take principals and put them in a fellowship where they receive executive skills and training that goes well beyond what they receive in their principal preparation programs, well beyond what the district or the network can provide. And I know I had an opportunity to participate not in this program as a principal, but in the Khan Fellowship as a principal. And at that time, I had been a principal for about 9 or 10 years, and really was at a point where I could do it standing on my head. I would literally say that some days as I was driving into work, which was not fun. And so a lot of those principals, they want to lead, they want to continue working at the school level, they want, you know, that engagement with students and teachers, but they want that next edge of challenge. And so what we did is paired them with Northwestern, which is another prestigious university right in our backyard, where they actually work at Northwestern's business school, which is Kellogg Business School, one of the top business schools in the country. And they meet with those professors on a monthly basis. They interact with CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and receive executive training as a result. The second part of that program is actually a monthly engagement with me, as I talked about earlier, and I'm like a policy wonk. I love policy, it's everything. But what I find is that people live in two different worlds. You have the people who like to write policy, and what I always tell my principals is that you can write a beautiful piece of policy in 2 hours at Starbucks on the weekend. It means absolutely nothing if people don't implement it. And principals or people in the field often criticize policy and put up barriers to implementing it because they don't understand the why and don't understand the complexity. So one of the things that I've been able to do when I started this when I was a chief ed officer is I meet with principals, and the first thing we do is just a deep study on policy formation and implementation. And I quickly get them up to speed on the literature around that so that they can understand what sounds great to you doesn't sound great to the teachers union. And what you may think sounds great to teachers doesn't work for parents. And so how do you get all of these various stakeholders to agree on an approach, you know, when all of us pretty much agree on the goals? We want a high quality education for kids. And so that has been transformational, not only because the principals feel so much engaged, they're getting this executive training, they're learning about leadership in other fields outside of education and seeing the correlation there, but they also understand how to influence policy in the district. And from a district leader standpoint, we get an added benefit, because when you have 600 leaders, and eventually we want everybody to go through this program, who understand how policy is formed, created, and implemented, you have better people supporting you on the ground level. You don't have a bunch of doers. You have people who are actually involved in the process, and you have people that are leading in very strong ways. So we've seen a lot of positivity around that. And then the third component is really our Principal Advisory Committee, which I'm sure a lot of the district leaders in here have something similar. And essentially what we do on the Principal Advisory Committee is that all of my department teams know that they have to take major policy changes. We have a policy change protocol that we use in the district that looks at all of those things that I kind of talked about earlier. But one final thing is that if there's a policy that in particular principals are going to be primarily responsible for implementing, they have to present that policy change to the Principal Advisory Council and get their feedback. And initially, again, this was something that I just started because I served as a principal a long time. I was very interested in policy changing and changed some policies as a principal by writing long emails. But, you know, it shouldn't just be the, you know, outstanding principal who can articulate that, who has hundreds of parents standing behind them that's influencing policy. Everybody should have a say in that. And it's gotten to the point now that our board actually knows that this is part of the process, and the board president, every time we present a policy change, his question is, what was the reaction from the principals? And if the person presenting that change cannot talk about principal support and buy-in for that policy, it's dead on arrival. You have to go back, you have to make the necessary tweaks and changes, because what we've learned is that if they don't buy into it, it's not gonna happen anyway, and it's not a good use of time and resource. So that's a little bit about how we support our principals. I tried to provide some specific examples because everybody says support, support, support. That's what it looks like. The last thing I'll say is that we work on succession planning, which is really in early stages where we want to, we have a really good system of tracking who is going to leave and who isn't going to leave. Of course, we can't publish that but we meet monthly and do what we call these talent projections. And one of the things that we are trying to do now is make sure that every single principal has a succession plan in place. And as you can imagine, that's an awkward conversation. People in education are not accustomed to doing that. Even at the CEO role, I mean, this was probably the first time the district that I can remember, it seemed like, had a succession plan in place. You know, I knew that was, you know, the next step for me when I was in my prior role. But now we're thinking about that, and I know many businesses, people know who's on first, second, and third, and that's what good organizations do, so that you don't lose the momentum and you don't lose all of the work that has been put in place. And we're doing that at the local level. And right now, about a third of our schools have a succession plan in place. But not everybody, you know, there's still some people like, why are you asking me? Why are you worried about my retirement? Why? Because we want to make sure when you leave, there is a high quality person there to replace you. And if that person is in your building, we want you to identify that person and start developing them. And if that person is not in your building, we want to help source candidates and make sure people are ready and learning about your school and learning about your community. So if you had asked me, like, what's the next edge of growth for our principal work, I would say that that's the area that we're really trying to tackle, because it's hard to get people to have that conversation. So thank you for listening. I know I said a lot really fast, hopefully in a short period of time. I have no concept of time. But I'll turn it over to you to take your questions. And I can't see half of the people.
Janice, and by the way, applaud, definitely kudos on the succession planning. That's huge, huge. Can we just talk about technology for a second? What's CPS, sort of where are we with technology used by students, devices?
I think our students use devices pretty extensively in our district. I think the next edge of growth is using them to be more efficient and effective, and not just like putting kids in front of computers or tablets for the sake of doing it. So we have started with personalized learning. It actually started through, again, we have an amazing support system outside of the district, and I talk about it all the time because I realize how rare it is for some people. But there's a group called LEAP that kind of started and incubated a lot of this work, and the good news is they started with early adopters and like a coalition of the willing. So people who wanted to do this work, who wanted to engage in changing the instructional program at their school. But later, now CPS has created an Office of Personalized Learning, where we have not only supported those schools, but brought more schools into the fold. And one of the things that we noticed with those early adopters, many of them were our highest performing schools, unfortunately, like so many other things. And so with the district pilot programs, we call them Elevate schools, we identified schools that were not the highest performing schools, but schools that had effective leaders. And so if you look at the portfolio of schools, and if you look at the list of schools in that portfolio, they are schools where maybe the achievement is not yet where it needs to be, but we believe in the leadership leading those schools and believe that they can really take it to the next level. From an infrastructure standpoint, I think we've done a lot to modernize our school system. When I look at the Council of Great City Schools kind of rankings around that, CPS is definitely in that top quartile, but I think as the third largest school district, we should be number 1, 2, or 3. So that's what I'm always pushing my chief IT officer on, but there's still a ways to go around that. I was talking at one of the tables over the past couple of days that we would like to get to 1-to-1 at some point, but observed, I should say, some other districts try to do that too fast, and it becomes a distraction. So we want to do it right. But my only point I'll make on this is I believe technology is important in the classroom, but nothing replaces a good teacher. And if you don't have effective teachers and teachers who know how to use the technology to support students, it can be a distraction. So I'm always looking for that balance and how the technology enhances the curriculum and instruction that's occurring every day.
I just wanted to ask a question about the politics around that succession plan. I think that is like a model. I'm from New York City, and I see what happens when that's not in place.
Yeah.
And it's really like a lever that really can make or break a school, as you
Yeah.
know. In that model, the principal is identifying their successor, and is there any challenge, like what if, for example, the network leader is in disagreement with, is there like a conversation where
It is.
they come to like a conclusion on who these potential successors are? And
So what you need to know in Chicago, as I mentioned earlier, is the local school council actually picks the principal.
Okay.
So that little group that I talked about, they actually have the power and authority to pick the principal, and that's a majority of our schools. We do have some schools that don't have a local school council because it's like it has an alternative school designation for some reason, or unfortunately in some of our underrepresented areas, they don't get the requisite number of parents to volunteer to be on this committee. But the committee has 6 parents, the principal, 2 teachers, 1 non-teaching staff member, and at the high school level, student, and 2 community members. So it's a group that represents a lot of different stakeholders. They actually have the power to hire and fire the principal, approve the budget. There's a third thing, I can't remember. They have 3 things that they can do. So the politics are very touchy. What we do know though is high performing principals, in almost every case, the LSC listens to that principal if they say this person should be the principal after I leave. The problem with that, as you pointed out, there are times that we at the district level don't believe that's the right person. People pick people for different reasons. And so we don't have any legal authority to change that. If the LSC picks a person that we don't think is ready, there isn't a thing we can do about it. So when I was a network chief, I would always tell the LSC, you can hire them, but I can fire. If you don't pick the right person, I'm gonna put them in place. And of course you wanna support them, but that's typically how it works. And then there are some cases where, you know, it's just really bad for the school. And so we do try to like encourage them to at least go through the process, you know, because if they just say, well, you know, we know that we want Miss so-and-so, we're like, at least interview people and, you know, go through the process. And sometimes they change their mind, oftentimes they don't. So the principal has a lot of influence in our city. They have a lot of influence, you know. Yes.
Could you talk about social emotional learning and how?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna say it's probably about a lot of stuff, but Chicago is actually a model around social emotional learning. We are part of the Castle Consortium. We're actually hosting this year, but I'd say that not just to put us out there. I mean, we've done a lot of work around that, again, from a policy standpoint, as well as the work that we do in the classroom. So some policy changes that the district made is that you cannot, we made it so that you can't suspend students, I believe it's 3rd grade or 2nd grade or below, which I was a high school principal, so that didn't affect me. But I have to be honest, I was not one of the early supporters of some of the policy changes because, you know, it was about accountability, and if somebody does this, you gotta do this. But what we ended up seeing is that when we changed our policy and made it so that students could not be excluded from school easily, attendance rates went up. Research is clear that attendance rates are directly correlated to student achievement. And actually, we saw that our schools were safer as a result. So we started to put more of a focus on influencing behavior as opposed to punishing students for behavior. So we've organized it around a 3-tier system. So, you know, tier 1 is what everybody gets, and I think that if I was giving us a grade, I think we have done a good job with like the tier 1 supports, but tier 2 interventions are coming along, and tier 3 would be kind of your most severe situations, either academically or socially. Socially, these may be students who need access to a professional, you know, outside of the school setting. We need better supports for that, and unfortunately there have been a lot of cuts in our state around social services and mental health supports, so it has made the problem much more difficult for our students that have been exposed to, you know, multiple forms of trauma. So that's still an area of focus, but I think we've changed the conversation and the narrative in our district around how we support our students. And just so that you know, also from a policy standpoint, I forgot to say this, on our school report card, on each school's individual report card, they get something called a safe school certification. So parents looking at a school can not only look to see what the test scores are, average attendance rate and all of that stuff, schools get rated based on the safety of the school, and it's based on you know, the suspension rates, the supports that are in the school, et cetera. And right now, about 335 of our schools have the Safe School certification, and there are others that don't yet have it. And what's interesting about this is some of the schools that don't have it are, again, some of our high-performing schools, and they don't have it because maybe there's a disparity between Black students and non-Black students and their suspension rates. And you know, there are other things that can make a school that otherwise looks good on paper not yet have the Safe and Supportive School certification. So I think that has helped bring about more transparency as well. You know the answer to all these questions.
No, I know. I just want to add, my name is Karen Fitzpatrick. I'm assistant principal at Chicago Public Schools. She did not pay me to say anything. But I just wanted to add, I'm a product of what you were just talking about in her succession, because she actually pulled my principal when she came into place. And we were in the middle of a very heavy changeover to competency-based learning. It was a very heavy lift, and I would just say if it wasn't for that succession and him putting input and then working with, we have as she said, alternative local school council, I was able to step in, and the assistant principal at the time was able to step in to be a principal, and we were able to carry that load. If not, I don't know what would have happened, because obviously with the teachers, whenever you're making some change, is that they need that trust that whatever or whoever is in place needs to be there. So, you know, I wanted to say I'm a product of that transition is very key.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
Can I ask, sorry, I'm fascinated by the fact you did this. So the teachers know the transition plan as well? The teachers
No,
know?
we have not gotten to that point. Now, some
Okay.
principals do, so I can think of, you know, it depends on the principal. Some people feel like they can't tell people until after testing, for example. That's a common theme. So, you know, we're in the middle of testing now. You know, there are principals that we know will not be coming back next year. They're moving, they're taking on other opportunities. They choose to tell their communities at different points in time. However, there are some principals who, you know, have such a trusting relationship with their community, or they feel confident that the work will continue, that people won't stop listening to them because they know they're not going to be their boss in 3 months. So they will tell them early enough so you can go through the process.
Signal that what I'm putting in place is going to last.
Yeah.
And that there's going to be consistency.
Yeah.
And also my AP, you should listen.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's one school, which is one of our high performing schools, where the principal is leaving. The principal told everybody in December, and because he wanted to make sure that the AP became the principal, but now he's in a place where he's stepping back and allowing her to lead, but she has the safety net of him still being there. And you know, those of us that have served as a principal know that having a safety net like that can be pretty helpful, because most of the time you're just kind of thrown in and expected to know everything, which we all know is totally not true. So go here and then over here. Yes, ma'am.
You spoke downstairs about using data as a big element of Chicago Public's work. Can you talk about the sources of the data and how you're really using it, or where you've seen the most effective use of data in terms of impact, like Dr. Hattie was talking about?
I think the thing that I pointed out around Freshmen on Track has probably been the best success. You know, as a researcher and also a practitioner, I know the tension that exists there. You know, researchers just talk about stuff, but practitioners, we think they don't do anything. And then as a researcher, we think practitioners, if only they paid attention to the learning and the findings and the trends, they would do a better job. So oftentimes those two areas don't converge, but because of our partnership with the University of Chicago, now mind you, this is a partnership that is decades in the making, and it took time to get there. You know, we listen to what they say, and it has influenced the practice in our district. And I can give you two quick examples. One was Freshmen on Track. That we didn't know what that was, but a professor at University of Chicago did a study that looked at CPS graduates and showed that, you know, again, kids who were on track at the end of 9th grade were 3 times more likely to graduate. We made Freshmen on Track a part of our school accountability policy. Many schools organize themselves around having teams to support freshmen, and so you see intensive support for freshmen to make sure they're on track. If they're falling off, we figure out why. You know, we do these reports we call them bag reports, which look at behavior, I should know these, grades, and attendance, right? Yeah, that's it. Behavior, grade, attendance, and grades, and they're bag reports. So in schools, every 2 weeks, we're pulling those reports, and if a student is off track, we look at those 3 areas to see why are they off track, and then there's an intervention represents that. Another example would be the consortium did a report that showed students in a particular program, our IB program or International Baccalaureate program, were actually graduating at rates higher than their peers who were not in those programs, and actually persisting and completing college at higher rates that were just astronomical, and even higher than students who attended some of our, the college completion rates were in some cases higher than students who attended some of our most selective schools. So again, that was good learning for us. We didn't have the resources to kind of track that, and so we have expanded our IB programs in CPS as a result of that, because we see clearly from the research that students who participate in this robust program are not only doing better in high school, but they're actually completing college at rates higher than our non-selective students. We have an amazing, I would say we have too much data in Chicago. We track almost everything, so it can be overwhelming at times. But part of the school quality policy, schools have to maintain clean data systems. So a part of the rating is just data quality. So is your system clean? Are you updating the students, the rosters, et cetera? So we have a lot of systems in place to make sure that the inputs that we put in are good, because bad data in is going to be bad data out. And so our system, it's pretty sophisticated, but if you go online and look up our school quality rating policy or go on that page, you'll see a lot of resources there. And one last question, and then
I just heard your comment about competency-based education. I was just interested in, is that district-wide, or how does that
No,
work?
actually, sorry, my voice. Her former principal, Alan Mather, is actually leading it because he started it at the school. And right now, I believe we have a cohort of, how many schools? 12. We have 6 who are officially in the pilot, and then a new group coming in of 6. So there are going to be 12 schools in the pilot. And again, another thing we're really proud of is a lot of the schools who led this work are some of our best schools, right? So people who are kind of out there, but in the pilot that we created, we wanted a representative sample. So in addition to some of our selective schools, which were already leaders in this, we have one of our special education specialty schools, which is in there, which is something we're really excited about, as well as neighborhood schools represented. So it's still in a very early stage. It's one of those things that, you know, we're hopeful, we think it's the right thing in spirit, but of course everybody worries because the demands on teachers, like everything that works, is so great. And, you know, we still debate with our teachers union about how many grades should go in the grade book every week. So in order to do competency-based learning, which I'm sure you can attest to, it requires a lot of the teachers around planning and assessment and creating these pathways for students. But we're just really excited because, once again, we have schools that have really done this for many years, and they're kind of leading that, and the district is just supporting the work. And again, it's all principal-led. You know, while they have a sponsor in Ellen Mather, who's a chief officer, this work is principal-led, and they're kind of bringing the district along. Yeah. All right. Thank you.